Mary felt sorry for Emma's frail health and made chicken soup for her. Emma, however, was worried that Mary would stop her from seeing her old flame, Jonathan, and gave Mary some sleeping pills. When the kitchen exploded, she was kissing Jonathan. I lay by Mary's hospital bed, and she, barely conscious, trembled as she held my hand.
I was just making chicken soup for Emily. How did I fall asleep?
I held Mary's cold body and called Emma dozens of times. Finally, she answered, her voice filled with impatience.
All I did was give your mom some sleeping pills. Is that worth so many calls?
If you don't like it, then let's get a divorce. Later, we did get divorced, and she regretted it. When the medical staff lifted both Mary and me into the ambulance, they began to administer emergency care to her. She had been unconscious when the firefighter rescued her.
Are you okay?
Sitting beside Mary's stretcher on the way to the hospital, I realized I was drenched in cold sweat, my stomach cramping. Forcing a smile, I shook my head.
I'm fine, just an old issue.
I had long been accustomed to my stomach problems, but I hadn't expected them to flare up at this moment. As the ambulance arrived at the hospital, I fought through the pain, pinching my palm to stay conscious, and urgently asked the nurse to save Mary. Her safety was my priority over my own discomfort. Once I could barely stand, I rushed towards the emergency room. I watched helplessly as Mary was wheeled in, my legs moving involuntarily to follow, but a doctor stopped me.
Are you the patient's family member?
Yes, I'm her son.
The patient's condition is critical. She is unconscious, has inhaled a significant amount of smoke, and has various degrees of burns on her body.
As I listened, my heart sank.
Please sign the critical condition notice so we can prepare for surgery.
With trembling hands, I took the notice and signed it. I hadn't even had a proper look at my mother before she was taken into the emergency room, her fate uncertain. I collapsed onto a chair outside, dialing Emma's number once more. The phone rang, and just as I thought no one would answer, she picked up.
What do you want? I told you I was busy. Why do you keep calling?
Her voice was impatient, and I could hear laughter and a man's voice in the background.
Emma? Who's calling?
If you have something to do, go ahead. I can entertain them myself.
Hearing the man's voice, a chill ran through me as I realized who Emma was meeting. Jonathan had returned. My wife's longtime infatuation. But now, I couldn't care about that. I heard myself say,
Mary is in trouble.
What?
I said, Mary is in trouble. She.
David, what kind of joke is this? I gave Mary a sleeping pill before I left. She was sound asleep when I left. What could possibly happen?
She laughed derisively.
To lie to me, you even make up stories about your mother being in trouble. What a dutiful son you are. But I don't have time to play with you right now.
Her words hit me like a bomb, leaving me dizzy. Emma's voice continued.
All right, Jonathan just got back. I'm very busy. We'll talk when I get home.
Before I could respond, the call ended. I stared at the darkened screen, my face wet with tears I hadn't noticed. Still unwilling to give up, I kept calling her, but she never answered again. With trembling hands, I sent her a message.
How could you give Mary the sleeping pill? How could you do this? Why?
After sending the message, I dropped my phone and leaned weakly against the wall. Emma and I had been married for 5 years, but she had loved another man for decades. I had hoped time would erode her obsession with Jonathan. I pretended not to notice her indifference, silently protecting our little family. But now, the harsh reality was laid bare before me. My wife had never stopped longing for another man. I met Emily during Jonathan's first month abroad. She often sat alone, a sadness she couldn't hide in her eyes. I don't know when it started, but I began to notice this girl who seemed to blend into the background. My gaze would often fall on her without her knowing.
Emily, forget him. Look at me, can you?
David, you like me, don't you? You like me, right?
Caught off guard, my face flushed, and I felt uncomfortable. But she looked at me, tears streaming down her face, yet she smiled and laughed.
But why doesn't he like me?
I remained silent, my heart aching. Then she held my hands and kissed my lips. From that moment on, she seemed to forget Jonathan and accepted our relationship. I thought she had moved on. But she hadn't. When Mary was wheeled out of the emergency room, she didn't look good. Her frail body was wrapped in a white blanket, her exposed arms covered in bandages. Seeing her like that, the tears I had held back fell uncontrollably. She was so old, yet she had suffered such severe injuries.
The patient is awake.
Hearing this, my eyes lit up, and I stood up, pleading to see Mary. With the doctor's permission, I entered the ICU. My throat was dry as I called out.
Mom.
Mary lay quietly on the bed. Seeing me, she turned her head with difficulty. She tried to reach out to me but found she couldn't move. My eyes were red as I looked at her, tears threatening to fall again. I wanted to do something for her but felt helpless.
Don't cry.
She forced a smile to reassure me. But her condition only made me feel more guilty. Tears streamed down my face as I clung to her bedside, my voice choked with emotion.
Why did this happen?
I was making chicken soup for Emily. How did I fall asleep?
Mom, what did you say?
Mary had been making chicken soup for her, but Emily had given her a sleeping pill to meet her first love, leading to the fire. It all made sense now.
It's my fault for worrying you. How is Emily? Is she okay? David, where's Emily? Is she okay?
David's eyes stung as he tried to speak, but no words came out. After his father passed away, he wanted Mary to live with them, but she refused, saying she was too old and attached to her home. She only visited them once a month. He knew she didn't want to intrude on their little family.
David, please, tell me about Emily.
When she arrived this time, she immediately noticed that Emma had lost weight and was heartbroken. She scolded David for not taking good care of his wife and insisted on nourishing her back to health. But why did she have to make soup today, and why did Jonathan have to return today? The thought made his heart ache as if it were being cut by a knife. Just as David was about to say something, Mary started coughing uncontrollably. He stood up in a panic, trying to comfort her. But the moment he touched her, his pupils dilated, and he lifted the blanket. Beneath the white blanket, the bandaged wound had reopened, and blood was flowing freely.
Mom, why are you bleeding so much?
His hands pressed helplessly on her shoulders, but her body was burning hot.
Mom, why are you so hot?
She kept calling Emma's name, but David couldn't focus on her words anymore. He pressed the call button by the bed, and still feeling it wasn't enough, he rushed to the ICU door, shouting for the doctor.
Doctor! Someone, help her!
When the doctor and nurses came in to check on Mary, David was pushed out.
The patient has lost too much blood and is in shock. Her vital signs are dropping.
She looked at David seriously, telling him to be prepared for the worst. His legs went weak, and his heart ached. His mind was filled with Mary's confused voice and Emily's smugness after giving Mary a sedative. Mary was still bleeding, but she kept murmuring Emily's name. And where was Emily? The thought filled David with resentment, and he slammed his hand against the hospital wall. The pain brought him back to his senses, and he took out his phone to contact Emily. He needed her to come, to let Mary see her and feel at ease for treatment. The phone rang and rang. David kept hanging up and redialing until she finally answered, annoyed.
I just gave her a little sedative. Do you have to call so many times? If you don't like it, then divorce me.
This wasn't the first time Emily had threatened David with divorce. He used to think it was just her way of being coquettish, and he would apologize and humor her. But at this moment, he realized she truly wanted a divorce. He could no longer deceive himself into thinking she loved him. And he could no longer say he loved her.
Fine, Emily, let's get a divorce.
His voice was calm, but his hand holding the phone trembled. There was silence on the other end, then she exploded in anger.
David, are you crazy?
The call ended abruptly, and David couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. A wave of sorrow washed over him.
Yes, I must be crazy to have loved you.
The intense emotional turmoil triggered his old stomach condition, and the pain brought him to his knees. As the pain intensified, he lost consciousness and fell forward, slipping into darkness. In the moment before I lost consciousness, I vaguely remembered her when we first got married. It wasn't supposed to be like this. When did things change? Or perhaps she never changed, and I was simply not the one she loved. When I woke up again, I was in a hospital bed. Realizing this, I quickly got up and left the room, my legs weak as I made my way to the ICU where my mother had been. But she was no longer there. Panic set in as I stared at the empty room. I rushed to the nurse's station to inquire.
Are you the patient's family? You're awake.
I had no time for pleasantries and nodded anxiously.
Where is the patient from that room?
The patient couldn't be saved last night. I'm sorry for your loss. Please accept our condolences.
Standing at the nurse's station, I didn't notice when the doctor who treated Mary yesterday appeared beside me. His words hit me like a sledgehammer. My legs buckled, and I took a step back, unable to accept the reality. How could this be? She was fine just yesterday. A dull pain gripped my heart as I dug my nails into my palm.
Are you okay? The body is in the morgue. If possible, you should take her home soon.
The doctor sighed softly and patted my shoulder in consolation. I forced myself to walk step by step into the morgue. The temperature was noticeably colder, and there lay my mother, so still. At that moment, I could no longer hold back my tears. I hugged her lifeless body and cried uncontrollably. I had failed her, subjected her to so much suffering. It was so cold here, she would be scared alone. I took Mary home. The traces of the fire were still evident. The property manager, seeing me return, nervously expressed his apologies. He had tried his best to clean up, making the shattered home look less desolate.
I'm so sorry. I did my best to clean up.
I had no patience to talk to him and simply listened before pushing him out the door. The house still reeked of the aftermath of the fire. Clearly, this home was no longer livable. After the fire, I took her ashes home. By the time I arrived, it was already dusk. Opening the door, the stifling smell of burnt walls and paint filled my nostrils. The warm little home had turned into ruins. The day I brought Mary back from the hospital, I sat in the living room for a long time, then tried to numb myself with alcohol. When I came to, it was already dark. The house was uninhabitable, so I took her to the funeral home. She stayed there for a few days, and I slept there, keeping her company. Now, opening the door, I saw that the kitchen had been partially restored by the workers the property manager had contacted. The burned walls in the living room had been repaired, hiding the traces of the fire. Standing outside, I felt a pang of sorrow. The last rays of the setting sun cast a lonely glow in the living room. I placed her ashes on the altar and took out the photo I had prepared for her. Just then, the door opened from the outside. Emily walked in, a look of surprise on her face as she smoothed her hair.
You're home? Not at work?
She walked in, but my gaze was fixed on the man behind her. This was the first time I saw him in person, yet I knew immediately that this was the man my wife had loved for decades.
What's that smell? It's awful.
She waved her hand in front of her face and spoke.
David, where's Mom? Look, I brought her some bird's nest soup to make amends.
Her words made my blood boil, and I glared at her with red eyes.
You're thinking of Mom now? It's too late.
Emily froze for a moment, then snapped.
David, what do you mean by this? I've already apologized. What more do you want from me?
With that, she angrily swung the bag of bird's nest soup she was holding and smashed it to the ground.
Fine, if that's your attitude, then consider my kindness wasted.
I stared at her actions in shock.
And you have the nerve to criticize me? You even made up a story about your mom being in trouble just to deceive me. Now you're taking pictures to comfort her?
She didn't give me a chance to react and knocked the photo out of my hand.
Such an ugly picture, and you have the audacity to display it?
The frame shattered instantly upon hitting the ground, and the photo fell out, landing in the bird's nest soup, becoming dirty and ruined.
Emily? How could you do this? This was Mary's favorite photo.
I looked at the photo, now soaked in dirty, and could no longer contain my dissatisfaction with Emily. I slapped her across the face.
That's my mom's memorial photo. My mom has been gone for a long time.
Do you know that when you left the house, Mom was still in the kitchen making chicken soup for you? But you gave her those pills just to meet someone else. She didn't even know why she suddenly fell asleep. By the time she woke up, there was already a fire. Do you understand? While Mom was fighting for her life in the hospital, what were you doing with this man in front of you? Do I need to spell it out for you?
My eyes were red, my voice dry and hoarse, as I pointed at the man behind her.
When we got married, you promised my mom that you would live a good life with me. You've let me down, and you've let my mom down. My marriage to Emily wouldn't have been possible without Mary's support. After being with Emily, I wanted to introduce her to my mom, to show her the woman I loved. I had a feeling my mom would like her too. The first time I brought Emily home, she showed a shyness I had never seen before. Mary took one look at her and felt an immediate affection. Emily was an orphan, raised in an orphanage. After reaching adulthood, she left the orphanage and lived on her own, never experiencing the warmth of parents or the feeling of having a home. When Mary found out, she was moved to tears and told me to take good care of her. From then on, she showered Emily with all her motherly love. To Mary, Emily was like her own daughter. Because she had no daughter, Mary poured all her care and affection for a daughter onto Emily. It was this mother-daughter-like bond that led to our marriage and the life we had now. I thought our little family would be happy forever. But Emily shattered that life with her own hands. I looked at the unfamiliar woman in front of me and remembered the photos I saw on social media. In the photos, Emily and Jonathan were passionately kissing. I should have been completely disappointed in her long ago. I poured out all my grievances.
How could this be? How could this be? You're lying to me, aren't you?
She said, gripping my arms tightly, but I shook her off without mercy.
Emily, you have no heart.
I knelt on the ground, my hands trembling as I brushed away the broken glass from the frame and picked up the photo, holding it close to my chest.
Why didn't you tell me?
How could I not have told you? I called you countless times, but what did you say? The messages I sent you are still there from yesterday. Early yesterday morning, I had sent her a message. When I finished speaking, she began to deny it.
Impossible. I didn't.
She suddenly fell silent, as if remembering something, and turned to look at Jonathan. Jonathan looked at me, then at Emily.
I deleted it. I didn't want you to be upset, Emily.
I let out a bitter laugh, but tears still streamed down my face. He didn't want her to be upset. So what about me? At that moment, I no longer had any desire to communicate. Looking at this despicable pair in front of me only filled me with disgust. I coldly ordered them to leave, then forcefully pushed them out of the house. I slammed the door shut and collapsed weakly to the floor. On the day of Mary's burial, Emily was there too. Her eyes were red from crying, and she silently followed behind me without saying a word. I had no more feelings left for her. As we reached the cemetery, the sky suddenly darkened, and a light rain began to fall. The broken portrait of Mary that Emily had shattered was replaced with a new one I had made. After Mary's burial, Emily clung to her tombstone, sobbing uncontrollably. She used to care so much about her appearance, but now her hair was a mess, sticking to her face. Her eyes were red, and she looked pitiful. I watched her, closed my eyes in pain, and when I opened them again, I was resolute.
Emily, let's get a divorce.
Her hands froze on the tombstone, and she looked at me in disbelief.
David, your mom just passed away, and you're doing this now?
Her voice was filled with resentment, and tears mixed with rainwater fell to the ground. I clenched my fists, restraining the urge to wipe her tears, and spoke coldly.
Emily, did you think about the consequences when you kissed Jonathan? You need to understand, you are the one who wronged me.
The pain I felt was a wound she had inflicted on my heart. After I finished speaking, she cried even harder.
David, don't you love me anymore?
I looked at the woman in front of me, wondering how she could still say such things. I turned my face away, refusing to look at her.
Emily, there is no future for us.
Fine, you said it, don't regret it.
She wiped the tears from her face.
Then I should thank you and your mom for bringing me and Jonathan together. Looking at it this way, your mom's passing wasn't in vain.
Emily's words pierced my heart like 1,000 swords. She laughed at my pain, then pushed me aside and walked away. I stood there in a daze, realizing this was her true intention all along. After she left, the rain grew heavier, blurring my vision until I could no longer see Mary. After Mary's passing, I spiraled into despair, wanting to give up on everything. I drowned myself in alcohol, lying on the cold floor. Just as I was about to end it all, I saw the bottle of sleeping pills in the corner. Then I should thank you and your mom for bringing me and Jonathan together. Looking at it this way, your mom's passing wasn't in vain. Emily's mocking voice echoed in my mind, turning into an inescapable torment. I stood up, stumbling towards the sleeping pills and picked them up.
Yes, my mom was gone. How could they be happy?
I sent Emily a big gift. I had previously withheld the truth to protect her, but now that we were divorced, I no longer had to consider her feelings. When I sent the thick stack of investigation results to her email, she called me repeatedly, but I ignored every call. After the calls were ignored, her messages bombarded me. I could almost imagine her red-eyed fury on the other end of the phone. Seeing her message asking if it was true, I felt a sense of satisfaction.
Whether it's true or not, you should ask Jonathan.
The first time I met Jonathan, I finally matched him with the person in the investigation report. Because of Emily's affection for him, I couldn't resist my curiosity and had someone look into Jonathan's life abroad. However, his life was not as glamorous as I had imagined. He lived a lavish lifestyle, had numerous relationships, and his behavior had once left me speechless. He even suffered from recurring health issues. To protect Emily's image of him, or perhaps to sever any ties between them, I didn't tell her the specifics. But now, I didn't understand why Jonathan had returned or why he chose to be with Emily. But since it was their choice, I thought Emily could accept the reality of the person she loved. I recalled Jonathan's appearance on the day of my divorce. He was there, following Emily, but I didn't want to interact with him. After leaving the Civil Affairs Bureau, I treated them as if they were invisible. I didn't expect Jonathan to stop me just as I was about to leave.
Thank you for taking care of Emily all these years. I will take good care of her from now on.
Emily, hearing his words, happily clung to his arm. I couldn't help but laugh.
How would he take care of her? With his broken body? All right. I wish you both a loving relationship, locked together forever.
The next time I heard about Emily was when I received a call from the police officer. Emily had committed a crime. I was in a daze when I heard the news. Seeing her in the holding cell, disheveled and muttering to herself, I couldn't believe it. The once charming and beautiful Emily was now in such a sorry state.
When we arrived, the man had already lost too much blood. She was covered in blood, holding a fruit knife, sitting in a pool of blood. She seems to be in shock and mentally unstable.
I approached her, calling her name repeatedly. She heard my voice, grabbed the bars, and stared at me with wide eyes, crying and laughing.
Jonathan, I loved you so much. I loved you so much, ha ha ha. Jonathan.
Looking at my former lover, I felt a pang of heartache. Driven by some inexplicable force, I asked,
Do you still recognize me? I'm David.
Hearing my name, she froze, then snapped out of it and shouted loudly.
David. David. I want to hurt you. I want to hurt you.
Seeing her like this, I smiled bitterly. Yes, how could I still have hope for her? She hated me. I stood in the way of her and her ideal love. I took a few steps back and left without looking back. She continued to shout at me.
David. You deserve to suffer. I want to hurt David.
I knew. I deserved to suffer. Mary was gone. The warm little home had turned into ruins. There was nothing left in this world for me. Like a soulless shell, I collapsed in front of Mary's tombstone. Empty beer bottles were piled around me. With the last bottle of beer, I took out the remaining sleeping pills from my pocket and swallowed them all. Drunk, I lay down in front of my mother's tombstone.
Mom, how much pain did you endure? Mom, walk slowly. Wait for me on the road to the afterlife. I'm coming to find you.